Imagine standing in the half-light of dawn, facing a wall. Not just any wall. The oldest wall ever built by human hands. It rises from the earth like a memory made solid. Ancient mud, brick, and stone that has stood for over 11,000 years. Your fingers touch the surface, and you feel something that takes a moment to name. Not just age, not just texture, something deeper than that. A recognition. Because for 290,000 years, anatomically modern humans wandered this earth without building anything like this. No cities, no permanent homes, just endless movement, following herds, chasing seasons, sleeping under open sky, carrying everything they owned in their hands and on their backs. Then, suddenly, almost overnight in evolutionary terms, everything changed. Right here, at this wall. And the question that has obsessed archaeologists for nearly a century, the question that keeps researchers awake at night, that fills thousands of academic papers and sparks heated arguments at conferences from London to Jerusalem to Istanbul, is a deceptively simple one. Why? What force was powerful enough to make nomadic people stop wandering and start building? What compelled them to trade the freedom of open plains, of endless horizon, of a life measured in movement, for existence behind walls? Because here is what makes this question so difficult to answer neatly. The first cities were nothing like what we imagined. No kings sitting on golden thrones. No priests in towering temples demanding tribute from cowering masses below. No armies marching in formation through broad central avenues. The archaeological evidence shows something far more radical than any of that. Something that challenges everything we thought we understood about civilization, about power, about human nature itself. And the deeper archaeologists dig, literally dig, into these ancient mounds of compressed human history, the stranger and more complicated and more genuinely surprising the picture becomes. So tonight, we are going back 11,000 years. Back to a world still exhaling after the long, cold breath of the last ice age. Back to the moment when humans decided, for the very first time, to try something that had never been attempted anywhere on Earth. Living together. Not in small family bands of 30 or 40 people who all knew each other by name and blood, but in communities of thousands. Dense, permanent, ambitious communities with shared spaces and shared rules and shared beliefs. No genetic programming for this. No instinct pointing the way. We are not ants or bees, creatures evolved for collective living. We are something stranger and more individual than that. This was pure invention, pure improvisation. A social experiment conducted without a blueprint, without any guarantee of success, without any way of knowing whether it would work at all. And the truth of what happened, the real truth, written in bones and buried floors and painted walls and collapsed mud brick, is more fascinating and more troubling and more human than any simplified story of progress could capture. Let us begin at the very beginning. Before the walls, before the cities, before everything changed. 15,000 years ago, in what we now call the Fertile Crescent, the Ice Age was finally releasing its grip on the planet. Glaciers that had blanketed much of Europe and Asia for 100,000 years were retreating northward, pulling back like a slow tide. And in their wake, something was happening in the Middle East that would have seemed almost miraculous to anyone watching from above. The land was transforming. Not into the desert we picture today when we think of Syria or Lebanon or southeastern Turkey. Not that dry, sun-bleached landscape of modern geopolitical maps. Something else entirely. A Mediterranean climate amplified to extraordinary richness. Rainfall that a modern farmer would weep to see. Temperatures that allowed plant growth almost year-round. And stretching across the hills and valleys from the Mediterranean coast all the way east toward the Persian Gulf, endless fields of wild grain. Wild wheat. Wild barley. Wild rye. These were not the domesticated crops we know from modern agriculture. These were their ancestors, growing untended, unprompted, naturally, in such density that in certain valleys you could walk for miles through chest-high stalks without ever seeing bare earth. Anthropologists call this period the Natufian, named after a valley in Israel where the first evidence of it was discovered. But that name is too quiet, too academic, to convey the sheer spectacular abundance of what the archaeological and paleoecological evidence describes. This was nature running a private experiment in plenty. a test of what the world could produce when climate and soil and rainfall all aligned simultaneously. And it was not only plants. The grasslands that spread across this warming, moistening landscape supported animal populations that beggar the imagination. Herds of gazelle numbering in the tens of thousands, moving across the hills in long dusty columns. Wild cattle, aurochs, massive shouldered creatures standing nearly 6 feet at the shoulder, browsing in the river valleys. Wild sheep and goats picking their way across rocky slopes. Deer in the forests, onagers on the plains. Flocks of migrating birds so dense they reportedly darken the sky during seasonal movements. Rivers and streams running clear and cold and full of fish. Into this paradise came small groups of human hunter-gatherers. Your ancestors, if you trace the lines far enough back. People who had spent the previous 200,000 years perfecting an ancient and highly effective art. The art of survival through mobility. They knew things about the landscape that would seem almost supernatural today. They could read subtle environmental cues, the angle of light through trees, the behavior of animals, the timing of plant flowering, and use that information to predict where resources would appear weeks or months in advance. They could identify hundreds of edible plant species by sight, smell, texture. They could track a single animal across terrain for days without losing the thread of its passage. They were, in the most fundamental sense, experts at not staying put. A typical hunting and gathering band numbered somewhere between 25 and 50 people. Extended family groups, mostly. A handful of adult hunters, their partners, children of varying ages, grandparents who served as living libraries of accumulated knowledge. They moved continuously, following the seasonal rhythms of the landscape. Here for the spring fish runs, there for the summer grain harvest, somewhere else for the autumn hunt when animals were fat from summer grazing. They traveled light because traveling light was survival. Everything you owned, you carried. A set of stone tools, weapons, spear throwers, perhaps already bows. Hide bags for gathering plant foods. Maybe a grinding stone, heavy and inconvenient, but necessary for processing seeds. Shelters were temporary almost by definition. Branches bent into frames and covered with hides in forested areas. Woven grass structures near rivers and lakes. You could make camp in a matter of hours and abandon it just as quickly when the resources in one place ran thin and the time came to move. This was the human condition for the vast majority of our species' existence. Not primitive in the dismissive sense the word usually implies. Not miserable. Not desperate. Just different from everything that came after. And it worked. It worked astonishingly well. Our ancestors survived ice ages and volcanic winters and predators and disease and every environmental challenge a highly variable planet could throw at them. They spread across every continent except Antarctica, adapting their strategies to environments as wildly different as equatorial rainforest and Arctic tundra. They were, by any reasonable measure, extraordinarily successful animals. But then something strange began to happen in the Fertile Crescent. Something unprecedented. Some groups stopped moving. Not completely, not overnight, but gradually, incrementally, across generations. Some Natufian bands began spending longer and longer periods at favored locations. Archaeological sites from around 13,000 years ago show it clearly. Permanent structures. Not the temporary shelters that leave only faint traces in the soil. Substantial buildings with stone foundations and timber frames. Structures that required significant labor investment, that were built to last not a season, but years, possibly decades. These weren't cities. They weren't even villages by any modern standard. A cluster of 4 or 5 structures housing maybe 3 or 4 dozen people. But they represent something revolutionary. For the first time in the human story, people were investing serious labor in something they couldn't take with them when they left. They were making a bet. A bet that the resources around them were reliable enough, productive enough, and consistent enough to make staying in one place worthwhile. And in the warm, wet, grain-carpeted landscape of the early post-glacial Fertile Crescent, that bet paid off spectacularly. Those wild grain fields were so dense and productive that a small group could harvest enough in a few concentrated weeks of work to feed itself for months. The gazelle herds moved through the same valleys at the same times every year, as predictable as tides. The rivers ran reliably. The woodlands provided fuel and building material within easy walking distance. Why keep moving when everything you needed was right here? So they stayed, and staying changed them, in ways that were subtle at first and then overwhelming. Permanent settlement rewired the relationship between these people and their world. When you're mobile, possessions are a burden. Every material object you acquire is something you must carry, and carrying costs energy, energy you cannot spare when survival depends on efficient movement. Mobile hunter-gatherers are famously unburdened by stuff. But when you're staying put, accumulation suddenly makes sense. You can have a good grinding stone and a spare grinding stone. You can collect pots and baskets and decorative objects. You can invest in furniture, in elaborate hearths, in storage containers. Archaeological sites from this period of early sedentism begin revealing exactly this pattern. Elaborate grinding stones for processing grain. Large storage pits lined with plaster to keep grain dry and protected from rodents. Decorative objects made from shells collected far from the sea, from stones that were clearly valued for beauty rather than function. The material world was expanding, but the most profound change was not material. It was psychological. Mobile hunter-gatherers have a particular relationship with territory. They pass through it. They use it and move on. The land is a resource to be exploited and then left to recover. But when you stay in one place, that hillside becomes something different. It becomes home. The spring where your grandmother used to collect water in the morning. The tree where your father told you the story of the great hunt. The rock formation where the children play. The slope where your family buries its dead. Every feature of the landscape accumulates meaning, memory, emotional weight. The boundaries between the human world and the natural world begin to blur in a new and spiritually charged way. We know about the spiritual world of these early semi-sedentary Natufian peoples because they left evidence. Carvings on stone. Careful, detailed representations of animals. Gazelle rendered with anatomical precision. Snakes coiling with evident symbolic significance. Birds in flight, and occasionally, more abstractly, human figures. But the most revealing evidence is in how they treated their dead. They buried their dead beneath the floors of their houses. Right there, under the ground where the living walked and slept and cooked and argued and made children. The dead were not removed to some separate, sanctified space at a distance from daily life. They were integrated into it, woven into the physical fabric of the settlement. And sometimes, months or years after initial burial, after the flesh had returned to earth, they would carefully excavate these graves and remove the skulls. Then they would plaster these skulls, cover them in clay mixed with fine aggregate, building up the features of the face. The nose reconstructed in careful relief. The cheekbones suggested. In some cases, shells were fitted into the eye sockets, giving the skull a disconcerting, watching quality. Then these plastered skulls were kept in the house. Displayed, positioned in places of significance, on ledges, in niches, against walls. Watching, your great-grandmother's shell eyes following you as you worked. This was not macabre by the standards of the people who practiced it. This was intimacy. This was a refusal to accept the finality of death, an insistence that the dead remain present, available, part of the ongoing conversation of family life. The ancestors weren't distant mythological figures invoked at seasonal ceremonies. They were right there, literally present. Their bones in the floor, their faces on the wall, their knowledge and their stories and their connection to this specific piece of land continuing to influence the living who moved through the same spaces. For over 2,000 years, this system, this combination of semi-sedentism, wild grain exploitation, systematic hunting, ancestor veneration, and accumulating material culture, worked beautifully. The Natufian people lived well. They multiplied. They spread their settlements across the Fertile Crescent in dozens of locations. They weren't farmers yet. Not exactly. They were experimenting with the management of wild plants, clearing competing vegetation from around productive grain stands, perhaps carrying seeds to new locations, perhaps protecting harvest sites from animal interference. They were standing on the very threshold of agriculture, 1 foot still in the mobile world of their ancestors, 1 foot stepping towards something entirely new. And then the sky fell. Around 12,800 years ago, something happened to Earth's climate that was catastrophic in the most literal sense of that word. We call it the Younger Dryas. That name, quiet, botanical, borrowed from a small tundra flower, does almost no justice to the violence of what occurred. In less than a decade, possibly in as few as 3 years, average temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. 10 to 15 degrees. In less than a decade. To understand what that means, consider that the difference in average global temperature between an ice age and our current warm period is only about 5 to 6 degrees. The Younger Dryas was a climate swing twice that magnitude, happening at a speed that left virtually no time for biological or human adaptation. The warm, wet, abundant world of the Natufian vanished. Not gradually, not over centuries of slow deterioration. It vanished the way a candle goes out when a door opens, suddenly, completely, leaving only the memory of warmth. The cause of the Younger Dryas is still debated among paleoclimatologists. The most widely accepted explanation involves the catastrophic release of massive amounts of fresh meltwater from retreating ice sheets into the North Atlantic, where it disrupted the ocean circulation patterns that normally carry tropical heat northward. When those circulation patterns failed, the warm water stopped arriving and temperatures plunged. Some researchers have proposed additional triggers: a comet airburst over the North American ice sheet, extraordinary volcanic activity, and the evidence for these scenarios is genuinely interesting, though not yet conclusive. What is not in dispute is the effect. Those endless fields of wild grain withered. The plant communities that had turned the Fertile Crescent into a garden retreated to small, scattered refuges in favored microclimates. The animal herds crashed as the grasslands they depended on converted to dry scrub. The rivers that had run reliably year-round became seasonal, unreliable, prone to failure. The buffet was closed, and it closed precisely on the people who had become most dependent on its reliability. The Natufians, who had settled down, who had built permanent structures and invested in grinding stones and storage pits and elaborate material culture, who had developed intimate spiritual connections to specific landscapes. These were the people hit hardest. Archaeological evidence from this period tells the story clearly. Many Natufian settlements were abandoned. Population densities dropped sharply. The evidence of feasting and communal activity diminishes. Signs of stress appear in the skeletal record. Shorter stature. More evidence of malnutrition in the composition and density of bones. More dental pathology consistent with dietary stress. Some groups responded to the crisis by reverting to the ancient strategy. They abandoned their permanent structures, picked up their tools, and returned to full mobility, following resources wherever they could be found, exactly as their ancestors had done for 200,000 years before the brief warm paradise of the Natufian period. For these groups, the nomadic life proved its worth once again. Flexibility, mobility, the ability to go where the resources were rather than waiting for the resources to come to you. Their descendants survived. Some populations pursuing similar mobile strategies are still living in parts of the world today. But other Natufian groups faced a different situation. They had been sedentary for so long, dozens of generations, in some cases, that the practical knowledge required for full-time mobile hunting and gathering had eroded. Or perhaps the landscapes around them had changed so severely that mobile strategies simply weren't viable anymore. Or perhaps, and this is the possibility that haunts the archaeological record, they had developed such deep attachments to their specific places, such profound emotional and spiritual connections to the particular hills and valleys and springs and burial grounds where their ancestors lay, that leaving was not psychologically possible. Whatever the reasons, some groups stayed, and they found a way to survive, not by returning to the old patterns, but by pushing forward into something entirely new. The crisis of the Younger Dryas, that catastrophic climate collapse, appears to have been the trigger for one of the most consequential inventions in human history. Not invented in a moment of inspiration, not the product of genius, but developed slowly, desperately, experimentally, by people trying to survive a disaster. They began deliberately planting wild grains, saving the seeds from the most productive plants, selecting, year by year and season by season, for the traits that made plants most useful to humans: larger seeds, heads that didn't shatter and scatter their grain before it could be harvested, stalks strong enough to support heavy yields. They began capturing young gazelles and sheep, keeping them penned, feeding them through lean seasons. breeding them in captivity, generation by generation, selecting for docility, for body size, for productivity. They were inventing agriculture and animal husbandry, not because anyone planned it, not because someone had a vision of what civilization might become, but because the alternative was starvation. And it worked, barely at first. Those first cultivated plants were nutritionally inferior to their wild ancestors, their seeds smaller, their distribution of nutrients less optimal for human health. The first domestic animals were scrawny and difficult compared to wild game. Early farmers were, as the skeletal evidence clearly shows, less healthy than the hunter-gatherers who preceded them, shorter in stature, more dental disease, more evidence of repetitive stress injuries from the grinding, harvesting, carrying, and planting that agricultural life demanded, more vulnerable to the specific nutritional deficiencies that come with a diet dominated by a single staple crop rather than the wide dietary variety that mobile foragers maintained. Agriculture, in other words, was a step backward in terms of individual health and quality of life. And yet, it was reliable. You couldn't control whether wild herds would pass through your valley in sufficient numbers this year. You couldn't predict whether good hunting weather would cooperate. You couldn't guarantee that the wild grain fields would survive another climate fluctuation. But you could control what you planted, when you planted it, what you selected from the harvest to plant again next season. You could count on your pinned animals being there tomorrow morning. They weren't going to wander away. They weren't going to migrate to a more productive valley and leave you with nothing. Control. For people living through a 1,000-year climate catastrophe, control was worth almost any price. Over centuries, this desperate improvisation transformed everything: the plants, the animals, and the humans who depended on them. Wheat and barley evolved larger seeds and non-shattering heads that made harvesting vastly more efficient. Sheep and goats became genuinely docile, genuinely dependent, genuinely domestic. Cattle, those massive, terrifying aurochs that could disembowel a hunter with a single horn movement, began the long process of becoming manageable animals under human direction. And humans changed, too. Populations in agricultural communities developed genetic variants allowing the digestion of milk sugar into adulthood, a trait nearly absent in hunter-gatherer populations. Digestive systems adapted to the high-starch diet that grain cultivation imposed. Immune systems began the slow, costly process of adapting to the novel disease environments created by living in close proximity to domestic animals and accumulated human waste. Coevolution in real time, driven not by vision or planning, but by crisis and necessity and the simple, powerful human determination to survive. The Younger Dryas lasted over 1,000 years. When the climate finally stabilized around 11,600 years ago and warmth returned to the Middle East, the people who had endured it emerged transformed. Agriculture was established. Domestic animals were multiplying. Villages, real villages, not semi-sedentary camps, but permanent settlements with substantial architecture, were appearing across the Fertile Crescent. The question was no longer whether humans would live in settled communities. That question had been answered by necessity. The question now was how far this experiment could go. How large could these communities become? How many people could live together in a single place? How complex could a human society become before it collapsed under its own weight? One group of people, on one particular stretch of land in what is now south-central Turkey, was about to attempt an answer. An answer that would reshape the human story so completely that we are still living inside its consequences today. They built something that shouldn't have been possible. Not yet. Not according to everything we thought we understood about how human societies develop from simple to complex, from small to large, from mobile to settled. The place is called Çatalhöyük. In the Konya plain of central Turkey, just east of the Taurus Mountains, a slightly elevated mound of compressed human occupation rises from what is now farmland. Wheat fields, ironically, still growing over the buried ruins of humanity's first serious urban experiment. For decades after its discovery, archaeologists couldn't agree on what to call it. Was it a village? A town? A city? Something for which no existing category was adequate? Because the problem with categorizing Çatalhöyük is that it doesn't fit neatly into any of the frameworks archaeologists had developed for understanding early settlement. When you're trying to define what makes a city, you run into definitional trouble almost immediately. Population size is arbitrary. Rome began as a cluster of huts. Athens remained smaller than many modern suburbs for centuries. Social complexity is difficult to measure from ruins. Monumental architecture appears in plenty of places that nobody would call cities. But most archaeologists agree that certain features, taken together, mark the transition from village to genuine urban center. Dense permanent population living in purpose-built structures. Specialized labor, people doing things other than farming and hunting. Some form of social organization capable of coordinating large numbers of people who are not all related to each other. Evidence of planning, of collective decision-making that goes beyond the scale of kinship groups. Catalhoyuk had all of this, and it had something else. Something that still makes researchers pause, still generates genuine scholarly excitement when they discuss it. At its peak, somewhere around 7,100 years before the Common Era, 9,000 years ago from where you are sitting right now, Catalhoyuk housed approximately 8,000 to 10,000 people in a single settlement, on 13 hectares of land, about 32 acres. For comparison, the entire area of this settlement, this place housing 10,000 human beings, would fit inside a modern shopping mall's parking lot with room to spare. 10,000 people, on 32 acres, living together every single day for 1,400 years. To understand why this is so extraordinary, you need to understand what other human settlements looked like at this same moment in history. Jericho, probably the most famous ancient settlement name outside of Catalhoyuk, dates to around 9,000 BCE, making it even older. Some archaeologists call it the world's first city. It had impressive fortifications. That famous tower, those stone walls, that remarkable defensive architecture that still draws visitors to the Jordan Valley. But at its peak, Jericho probably housed somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people. Most Neolithic farming villages of this era housed fewer than 200. Extended family groups, kinship networks, small enough that everyone knew everyone else by name, by family relationship, by personal history. Catalhoyuk was not a larger version of these settlements. It was something categorically different. It was a place where, by definition, you could not know everyone, where strangers lived next door, where social organization had to be invented at a scale for which human psychology had no prepared template. And it was strange. Genuinely, profoundly, paradigm-challengingly strange. There were no streets. None. Not even narrow alleyways between buildings. The houses at Catalhoyuk were built directly against each other, sharing walls, packed together in a continuous honeycomb of mud, brick, and plaster that covered the entire settlement area without interruption. If you wanted to travel from one side of the city to the other, you did not walk down a street. You climbed onto your roof, walked across it, stepped onto your neighbor's roof, continued across the next roof and the next and the next, following worn pathways across the continuous expanse of flat mud brick surfaces that constituted the only public space Catalhoyuk possessed. The entire city was a rooftop. Think about what this means architecturally, socially, psychologically. No front doors opening onto a public thoroughfare. No separation between the space where you lived your private life and the space through which strangers passed. Instead, the interface between your home and the outside world was above you. Your roof was everyone's pathway. Everyone's roof was your pathway. And you entered your home not through a lateral door, but through a vertical hatch, a hole in the roof, accessed by a wooden ladder, through which you descended into the interior space below. Every single dwelling in Catalhoyuk worked this way. Hundreds of them. Every morning, thousands of people climbing ladders from their underground domestic worlds into the rooftop city above. Every evening, descending back through their hatch openings into the darkness below, pulling their ladders up behind them. When British archaeologist James Mellard arrived at this site in 1958, he was looking for a Neolithic village. The mound had been known to archaeologists for decades, just another artificial hill of accumulated human occupation in a region full of them. Nobody expected what he found. The first season of excavation revealed a few houses. Well preserved, interesting, but not immediately revolutionary. The second season revealed more. The third season revealed the full, overwhelming, impossible truth. As Mellard's team expanded their excavation area in every direction, they kept finding the same thing. More houses, and more, and more, densely packed, sharing walls, all built to the same general architectural plan, all accessed from above, all containing the same basic internal arrangement. By the end of his early excavations, Mellard had realized he wasn't looking at a large Neolithic village. He was looking at something for which the entire existing vocabulary of prehistoric settlement studies was inadequate. The scale becomes clear when you begin to understand the layout in detail. Each house was roughly rectangular, averaging around 25 square meters of floor space. That is approximately 270 square feet, roughly the size of a modern studio apartment, though with very different internal organization. Inside each structure, the layout followed a pattern so consistent across hundreds of excavated examples that it appears to represent a shared cultural standard, a collectively agreed upon template for domestic space that was maintained across centuries and generations without significant variation. A main room with built-in platforms along the walls, constructed from mud, brick, and plaster, serving simultaneously as seating during the day and sleeping surfaces at night. A hearth for warmth and cooking. An oven, a rounded clay construction built directly into one corner, for baking the flatbreads that constituted a central element of the diet. Storage bins set into or below floor level, sealed against moisture and vermin. And beneath the floors themselves, beneath the platforms where people slept, beneath the hearth where food was cooked, burial spaces. Graves containing the remains of family members across multiple generations, their bones compressed and rearranged over years as new burials were added to the same spaces, the dead quite literally integrated into the physical structure of the living home. But what makes Catalhoyuk genuinely urban, what elevates it beyond even a very large, very dense village, is the evidence for economic specialization and collective organization that goes beyond anything kinship networks alone could produce. Not everyone was farming. This is the crucial point. In a typical Neolithic village, the economic activities are simple and universal. Everyone grows food. Everyone tends animals. Everyone hunts when hunting is possible. Specialization barely exists. But Catalhoyuk was producing obsidian tools, the razor-sharp blades made from volcanic glass, in such enormous quantities that they were clearly being traded across vast distances. Pottery was being produced with evident skill and in considerable variety. Textiles were being woven from plant fibers. Elaborate art was being created, paintings, sculptures, reliefs, that required time and skill and concentration that farming alone could not spare. These activities required specialists, people who spent significant portions of their time doing things other than producing food, which means the community had to be organized in ways that allowed some people to not farm while ensuring everyone still ate. That requires economic complexity, mechanisms for the redistribution of resources, decision-making structures capable of operating at the scale of thousands of people rather than dozens. And yet the excavations have found no palaces, no temples clearly architecturally distinct from ordinary residential buildings, no obvious administrative structures, no warehouses or redistributive centers. What they have found instead, and this is where Catalhoyuk becomes philosophically extraordinary, is evidence of a society that maintained remarkable equality at its foundations while clearly achieving the kind of coordinated complexity we associate with much later, more hierarchically organized urban centers. The houses, while roughly similar in size and layout, show subtle but consistent differences. Some have more elaborate wall paintings. Some contain more high-value goods. Some burial assemblages include more prestigious items. But there are no mansions next to slums. No obvious elite residential quarter. No architectural expression of power dramatically different from the surrounding domestic fabric. It appears, and this interpretation remains debated, that Catalhoyuk was organized not through top-down authority, but through something more distributed. Networks of obligation and exchange. Shared ritual practices that created collective identity without requiring a central authority to enforce it. Social norms maintained through the constant visibility of rooftop life, where everyone could see what everyone else was doing, where privacy was a concept that barely applied to anything beyond what happened below the roofline. 1400 years. That is how long Catalhoyuk persisted. Archaeologists have identified at least 18 distinct building levels within the mound, 18 separate phases of construction, demolition, and rebuilding, each representing 1 or 2 generations of occupation. Each phase shows roughly the same population density, the same architectural style, the same basic social organization, the same strange, fascinating, stubbornly maintained commitment to life in a city without streets. The site eventually rose to over 20 meters in height, 65 feet above the surrounding plain. The accumulated weight of all those generations pressing down into the earth, turning the ruins of one generation's houses into the foundation of the next. When they finally abandoned it, sometime around 5600 BCE, for reasons we will explore, the people of Catalhoyuk had sustained the most ambitious social experiment in human history up to that point. They had demonstrated, conclusively and across an extraordinary span of time, that human beings could live together in communities of thousands, that strangers could coexist, that a city without kings, without obvious temples, without streets could function, could even thrive. And when Mellart finally uncovered it in 1958, he was not just finding an ancient settlement. He was finding the proof that our ancestors were capable of social complexity far earlier and of far more radical variety than anyone had imagined. You wake up in darkness. Not complete darkness, because in Catalhoyuk there is never quite complete darkness. The hearth in the corner still holds coals from last night's fire, casting dim orange warmth across white plaster walls. Above you, through the single opening in your ceiling, the sky is just beginning to lighten. And already there are footsteps. There are always footsteps. Because in the world's first city, nobody walks on streets. They walk on roofs. Your roof. The sleeping platform beneath you is hard, packed earth overlaid with reed mats and animal skins. Around you, still sleeping, 3 generations of your family occupy this single room. Grandparents against the north wall. Your children nearest the oven, where it stays warmest through the night. Your partner beside you. This is not poverty. This is simply the way life is organized here. Everyone in Catalhoyuk lives like this, packed into rooms 25 square meters in area, sharing walls with neighbors on every side, hearing through those walls the sounds of other lives proceeding simultaneously, children crying, arguments, laughter, the rhythmic sound of someone grinding grain at 3 in the morning because the heat in the daytime makes it impossible. You climb carefully off the platform. The floor is cold under your feet, tamped earth mixed with clay, polished smooth by years of daily use. But you are careful where you step, and not only because of sleeping family members. Because beneath this floor, beneath the very ground you walk on every day, your ancestors are buried. Your grandmother is somewhere under the northwestern corner. An infant sibling who died 7 years ago rests beneath the sleeping platform. Perhaps 8 or 9 bodies total, interred over the decades this house has stood, accumulated in the earth below like layers of time. This is not disturbing to you. This is comfort, continuity. Your family is not merely living in this house. They are part of it. Their bones literally support the structure above them. When you die, you will join them, wrapped in a reed mat and lowered into the same earth where you spent your life sleeping and eating and raising children. The ladder in the center of the room is the only way in or out. No doors, no windows. Just this wooden ladder leading up through the opening in the roof, which serves simultaneously as entrance, exit, chimney for the hearth smoke, and the sole source of natural light and air. You climb up, push through into the morning, and suddenly the world changes. The rooftops of Catalhoyuk stretch in every direction, an expanse of flat mud brick surfaces broken by the dark openings of roof hatches and the occasional cluster of activity around communal ovens built into raised areas between house groupings. People are already moving, crossing from roof to roof on paths worn smooth by 10,000 daily passages. A woman with a large jar balanced on her head, making her way toward the outer edge of the settlement where the water supply is accessed. 2 men carrying obsidian cores wrapped in leather, heading south toward the workshop areas. Children chasing each other across the rooftops with the reckless confidence of people who have grown up navigating this elevated cityscape since before they could walk reliably. The sun is still below the horizon, but the sky above the Kanya plain is pink and silver, and in the far distance the twin volcanic peaks are visible, dark against the lightning east. Those volcanoes, Hassan Dag, 60 miles away, are the reason this city exists. From their flanks comes obsidian, the black volcanic glass that can be worked into edges sharper than modern surgical steel, that can be shaped into tools of extraordinary precision, that is valued across hundreds of miles of trade networks connecting this city to the wider Neolithic world. Without the obsidian trade, Catalhoyuk could not feed 10,000 people. Without the trade, the specialists could not specialize. Without the specialists, the social complexity that distinguishes this place from every other settlement in the region collapses back into simple village life. The obsidian is the foundation. But we will come back to that. First, there is the morning to get through. The communal oven 3 rooftops away is already producing smoke and the incomparable smell of baking bread. Several families share this oven, taking turns, operating on a schedule of mutual accommodation that has apparently been working for generations without anyone needing to write it down or appoint an administrator to enforce it. The woman tending the oven this morning is someone your family has known for years. She and your mother trade obsidian tools for the flatbreads she produces in surplus, a comfortable reciprocal arrangement embedded in a larger network of similar arrangements connecting dozens of households in this part of the settlement. You exchange information while the bread finishes. Whose child has a fever? Which family is expecting a new arrival? What the hunters reported seeing on the plain yesterday? Whether the grain in the western fields is ready to harvest yet? This is how Catalhoyuk works. Not through formal administrative channels, not through decrees issued from a central authority, but through this constant circulation of information across rooftop pathways, through the dense social network that forms when 10,000 people live within a few hundred meters of each other and interact constantly. Everyone knows approximately what is happening everywhere. Social pressure is the primary mechanism of social control. You can see who is not pulling their weight. You can see who takes more than their share. You can see who is reliable and who is not. Privacy barely exists above the roofline. Everything of consequence happens in full view of the community. You take your bread and find a spot on the roof's edge where you can sit with your legs dangling and watch the city fully wake. Below you, in the narrow spaces between the outer walls of the settlement and the surrounding plain, the secondary activities of the city are visible. Animal pens where the newly domesticated cattle shift and low in the morning cool. Clay pits where potters are already beginning the day's work. The middens, the refuse heaps, where household waste accumulates in layers that will one day tell archaeologists everything they need to know about what people ate, what they made, and what they discarded. The cattle in those pens are recent. Very recent, in historical terms. 2 or 3 generations ago, your great-grandparents hunted aurochs, wild cattle as massive and dangerous as any large predator, animals that could kill a hunter as readily as a hunter could kill them. But someone figured out that if you captured the calves young enough and raised them from infancy, they became manageable. Not tame, exactly. Not the placid, heavy domestic cattle that will develop over the next few thousand years of selective breeding, but manageable enough to keep penned. Manageable enough to use for meat and hides on your schedule rather than the animals. The process of domestication is well underway, though nobody living now will see its completion. That will be left to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren to refine. By mid-morning you are inside, working. Your family's contribution to the city's economic life is obsidian tool production. Not the finest and most demanding work, the polished obsidian mirrors that take skilled craftspeople weeks to produce, or the long, thin ceremonial blades that require extraordinary technique, but the practical everyday cutting tools that every household needs constantly. Knapping flakes, scrapers, simple knife blades. The obsidian cores come from the volcanic sources 60 miles to the east, traded into Catalhoyuk through networks that have been functioning since before anyone now living was born. Your family receives raw cores from the traders and transforms them into usable tools, then trades those tools within the local network for the food and textiles and pottery that you don't produce yourselves. You work through the morning, your children watching and learning, your mother occasionally correcting your angle or force when she can see from experience that you're about to make a mistake. The sound of stone meeting stone fills the small room, a sharp crack each time the antler hammer strikes the core at precisely the right angle to detach exactly the right flake. It is skilled work. It requires years to learn and decades to master. But it is not all that you do. Nobody in Catalhoyuk does only one thing. The specialization here is real but partial. Everyone still participates in food production at certain times of year. The harvest requires all available hands, the spring planting similarly. But between those seasonal demands, different households focus on different productive activities, and those different outputs circulate through the community through networks of exchange that economists would recognize as a sophisticated non-monetary economy. The afternoon brings different work. Your partner is weaving, using a simple but effective loom propped against the south wall. The thread is spun flax, plant fibers processed through multiple stages of labor into thread fine enough to weave into cloth. The process from raw plant to finished textile is extraordinarily time-consuming, but the result is valuable. Fine linen like cloth that trades well, that serves as clothing and bedding and wrapping material for the dead. The textiles of Catalhoyuk have not survived the millennia. Organic materials rarely do, but the loom weights and spindle whorls that have survived in large numbers tell the story of a community where textile production was a major economic activity, almost certainly conducted primarily by women, representing a significant portion of the settlement's overall productive output. There will be a burial this evening. An old man in a house 3 rooftops over died yesterday. His body has been prepared. Tonight his family will inter him beneath their floor. This is not an unusual event. Death is too common in Catalhoyuk to be treated as an occasion for dramatic mourning. Children die regularly. The skeletal evidence suggests that a significant proportion of burials are of individuals under the age of 5. Women die in childbirth. Men die from the accumulated injuries and infections that physical labor and dense urban living make inevitable. Old age is an achievement, a cause, in its way, for quiet acknowledgement. You will attend the burial. Everyone will attend. Not because attendance is compulsory, but because these shared rituals of community life are the connective tissue that holds 10,000 people together without the enforcement mechanisms that later civilizations will develop. The ritual preparations happen inside the house, out of your sight. But you know what is occurring. The body is being tightly flexed, knees drawn up to chest, arms folded around them, reducing its volume to fit within the shallow pit that has been dug beneath one of the sleeping platforms. It is wrapped in a reed mat, bound with plant fiber cord. Meanwhile, a family member works in the confined space beneath the platform, digging through the compacted floor with stone tools, careful not to disturb the earlier burials that lie below. When the time comes, a dozen neighbors descend through the roof hatch into the house. The room is packed, barely space to stand. The wrapped body lies beside the open pit. Words are spoken, not prayers in the formal sense. There appear to be no priests here, no specialized religious functionaries to perform prescribed liturgy. But words nonetheless. Acknowledgement of the life that has ended. Recognition of the passage into the company of ancestors. The body is lowered. The pit is filled. Tamped down carefully. Within weeks the floor will be replastered over the disturbance. Within months you will not be able to identify the spot from looking at it. But everyone in the house will know. They will know for generations. The man will become part of the house. His presence woven into the fabric of the domestic space exactly as every other ancestor's presence has been woven before him. His bones joining the community of bones beneath the floor. His memories circulating in the stories told on the rooftops and around the hearths of this first, strange, remarkable city. You climb back up to the rooftop as the light fails. The Kanya plain to the south is turning purple in the evening light. Smoke rises from hundreds of hearths. The smells of cooking and human habitation drift across the city. Children are being called inside through roof hatches. The last workers are returning from the fields. The obsidian traders who arrived this afternoon are settling in at whatever household has agreed to host them. You sit for a moment before descending, looking out across this place. 10,000 people. No streets. No kings. No temples standing apart from the houses of ordinary people. Just families in rooms, connected by rooftop pathways and shared ovens and trading relationships and the bones of their ancestors beneath their feet. It is not easy. The archaeological evidence makes clear that Catalhoyuk was not some utopian paradise. The bones in those floors tell stories of hard labor and nutritional stress and disease and violence. There is evidence of healed skull fractures consistent with blows from hard objects, suggesting conflict was not unknown within this supposedly egalitarian community. Life expectancy was not long. The air inside those unventilated rooms, thick with hearth smoke and cooking smells and the exhalations of multiple generations sleeping in a space smaller than a modern living room, was probably not conducive to respiratory health. Sanitation was a constant challenge in a settlement where 10,000 people lived on 13 hectares without any obvious sewage infrastructure. And yet, they persisted. For 1,400 years, generation after generation, they maintained this extraordinary experiment, passed down the knowledge of how to build and maintain a city without streets, transmitted the cultural templates, the house layouts, the rooftop social conventions, the burial practices, the wall paintings, the obsidian trade networks that kept this particular form of urban life functioning. They did not know they were making history. They did not know that 9,000 years later, scholars from the other side of the planet would be excavating their floors and analyzing their bones and writing careful academic papers about the significance of their roof hatches. They were just living, eating and working and burying their dead and waking up the next morning to do it all again. But in living this way, in choosing, or perhaps being compelled by circumstance to choose, this dense, collaborative, fundamentally urban form of existence, they were creating something genuinely new in the world. A new way of being human. A way that would, in the centuries and millennia that followed, spread and diversify and generate every city that has ever existed, including the one where you are, right now, listening to this. Now we need to talk about what they believed. Because the houses of Catalhoyuk are not just domestic spaces. They are something more than that. Something stranger. When Mellart first excavated these buildings in the early 1960s, he expected to find what archaeologists had found at every other ancient settlement of sufficient size and complexity, a temple. A separate building, architecturally distinct from the surrounding residential structures, clearly dedicated to religious or ritual purposes. The evidence of belief kept separate from the evidence of daily life. Instead, he found that every house was a temple. Walk into any dwelling in Catalhoyuk and you are immediately confronted by something that has no business being in a living room. Mounted directly into the wall plaster, not carved, not painted, but physically embedded, the actual skulls and horn cores of aurochs. Wild cattle, the largest, most powerful, most dangerous animals in the Neolithic world. Their skulls are built into benches at floor level so that you sit on them. Their horn cores project from the walls at head height, curving into the room, massive and present. In some houses there are multiple installations, 3 or 4 sets of horns in a single room, creating a gallery of bovine power that dominates every interior. These were not decoration in any modern aesthetic sense. The positions, the numbers, the contexts all suggest something more intentional than ornament. These were statements of relationship, assertions of a particular kind of power. The aurochs was wild, dangerous, emblematic of everything beyond the domesticated, managed, human-controlled world of the city. Bringing its skull and horns into the house was not celebrating the kill, exactly. It was something more complex. An acknowledgement, a symbolic taming, a way of saying, we have not forgotten what lies outside these walls. We have not pretended that the wild world does not exist or does not matter. We have brought its power inside and made it ours. But the horns were only the beginning. Look at the walls and you encounter something that has made researchers reach for comparisons to the cave paintings of Lascaux and Altamira, the great Paleolithic art traditions of tens of thousands of years earlier. Sophisticated, layered, meaningful paintings covering the white plastered surfaces. Geometric patterns first. Diamond shapes, zigzags, parallel horizontal bands. Complex interlocking designs that flow across entire wall surfaces in colors made from mineral pigments, red ochre, yellow ochre, black from carbon, white from the lime plaster itself. At first glance, these look like abstract decoration, the kind of pattern a weaver might produce on a textile, translated to the wall surface. And some of them may be exactly that, decorative patterns derived from textile traditions, reflecting the visual vocabulary that weavers developed over generations. But some researchers looking at these geometric patterns have proposed something more radical. They suggest that certain of the most complex and carefully executed geometric compositions are cartographic maps, representations of the landscape surrounding the settlement, rendered in the abstract visual vocabulary available to people who had no tradition of realistic landscape representation, but who understood space and geography intimately through decades of practical engagement with the terrain. If this interpretation is correct, and it remains debated, genuinely, seriously debated among archaeologists who have examined the evidence, then the people of Catalhoyuk were doing something extraordinary. They were abstracting three-dimensional space into two-dimensional representation thousands of years before anyone is supposed to have invented maps. They were thinking cartographically, organizing the chaotic complexity of the natural world into comprehensible, manipulable patterns on their walls. Which would mean that abstract visual thinking, the cognitive capacity to represent spatial relationships symbolically, was present at the very dawn of urban life. Not a product of later civilizational development, a precondition of it. But not all the paintings were geometric. Some were vibrantly, uncomfortably realistic. Leopards, painted life-sized, in exact profile, with every spot carefully rendered, every muscle suggested by the skilled manipulation of pigment. Stalking, crouching, positioned not in safe upper corners of the room, but at eye level, oriented toward whoever stood in the room's entrance. Appearing, to a visitor stepping down through the roof hatch into the dim interior, to be leaping directly at them. The psychological effect, in the flickering light of an oil lamp in an otherwise dark room, would have been extraordinary, viscerally powerful, designed to provoke a physical response, the sudden intake of breath, the spike of adrenaline, that no painted geometric pattern could produce. These were predators painted with full understanding of what made predators terrifying. And they were placed in living rooms, in the spaces where children slept and mothers nursed infants and grandparents told stories. Why? What does it mean to bring the image of an apex predator into the most intimate domestic space and position it there with evident deliberate intention? The answer probably involves the same logic as the aurochs horn installations. A refusal to forget, an insistence that the wild, the dangerous, the uncontrolled, the powerful, not be excluded from human consciousness just because walls had been built and agriculture had been developed and the illusion of control over nature had been partially achieved. The people of Catalhoyuk had come from hunter-gatherer ancestors very recently, in historical terms. The memory of living within the wild world rather than adjacent to it was not distant. It was right there in the cultural DNA, in the stories, in the art. The leopards on the walls were a reminder. We came from that world. We are not entirely separate from it. We should not pretend otherwise. Then there were the vultures. In several buildings, large-scale paintings depicted enormous birds, vultures, identifiable by their characteristic hunched profiles and bare heads, shown in relationship with human figures. Specifically, shown attending headless human bodies. Corpses. The vultures are not fleeing or incidental. They are engaged, present, active participants in whatever is being depicted. For decades after their discovery, these paintings generated fierce debate. Were they narrative, depictions of actual events, perhaps sky burial practices where human corpses were exposed for consumption by birds before secondary burial of the remaining bones? Were they symbolic, representations of death and transformation, the soul's passage from the physical body into something beyond? Were they cosmological, maps of the relationship between the human world and whatever lay beyond it, with the vultures serving as psychopomps, guides of the dead through the transition between states? The answer, when it finally came through careful analysis of multiple lines of evidence, was yes to all three, and more complicated than any single interpretation could capture. Because the people of Catalhoyuk did, in fact, practice a form of excarnation, the deliberate exposure of bodies to allow the flesh to be removed by birds and other scavengers before the bones were gathered for burial. The plastered skulls with their shell eyes are often found separated from their post-cranial skeletons. This is consistent with a burial tradition in which the body first goes through a period of exposure. The skull is then recovered before or after it would be carried off entirely, and the skull is preserved and maintained while the remaining bones are buried beneath the floor. The vultures in the paintings are not horror. They are participants in a sacred process. necessary agents in the transformation of the dead from one state into another. Their presence on the walls of living spaces is an acknowledgement of this role, a visual incorporation of the entire cycle: life, death, exposure, decomposition, transformation, ancestral presence, into the domestic world where all of life's other activities occurred. And then there is the figurine, the seated woman of Catalhoyuk, small enough to hold in one hand, perhaps 6 inches in height, made from fired clay. She sits on what appears to be a throne, a seat flanked by armrests that take the form of large felines, probably leopards, whose heads her hands rest upon. Her body is abundant, heavily fleshed in a way that reads as intentional emphasis. This is not a thin figure to which fat has been added accidentally, but a representation in which abundance of body is clearly the point, clearly what is being communicated. Her face is small by comparison, almost summary. A nose, suggested eye sockets, little more. Because the face is not what this figurine is about. When Mellart found her in 1961, excavated from a grain bin where she had apparently been deliberately placed, concealed, stored, offered, he immediately and confidently declared her a mother goddess. Evidence of matriarchal religion. Proof of a universal ancient worship of female fertility deities preceding the patriarchal religions that followed. This interpretation caught fire. It resonated with certain ideological currents of the 1960s and later decades. It was appealing, poetic, and satisfying as a narrative. The peaceful, egalitarian, goddess-worshipping first cities displaced by violent, hierarchical, God-worshipping later civilizations. There was only one problem. The evidence didn't support it. Subsequent excavations, especially the large-scale, rigorous, multidisciplinary work conducted by Ian Hodder and his team beginning in the 1990s, found hundreds of figurines at Catalhoyuk. And the vast majority of them were not representations of full-figured women. They were animals: bears, cattle, sheep, boar. Of the human or humanoid figurines, both male and female forms appear, along with figures whose sex is ambiguous or whose form defies simple categorization. The seated woman is extraordinary. She is clearly a significant and intentional creation, but she is not evidence of a universal mother-goddess religion. She is evidence of a society in which the human relationship with animals, with the wild, the powerful, the fecund, the dangerous, was being worked out in clay and plaster and paint on walls, generation after generation, in every household of the world's first real city. What she represents, these researchers now argue, is something more interesting than a goddess. She represents the complexity of how these people thought about the boundaries between human and animal, between domestic and wild, between the controlled world of the city and the uncontrolled world that surrounded it. She is a woman. She is enthroned. She is attended by leopards, wild, deadly, untamable. She has given birth, or is giving birth. Some interpretations suggest the figure between her legs is an emerging infant, others that it is the head of an animal. She is at once domestic and wild, human and something more than human, controller and controlled. This is not a simple fertility goddess. This is a representation of one of the deepest questions the first city dwellers were wrestling with. What are we? We who have built walls and planted grain and pinned animals and buried our dead beneath our floors. What are we in relation to the world beyond these walls? Are we still part of nature, or have we separated ourselves from it? If we have separated ourselves, what have we lost? If we have not, why do we pretend that we have? These are not primitive questions. These are not simple questions. These are the questions that every civilization that has followed Catalhoyuk has been wrestling with, in its own way, in its own vocabulary, ever since. Now we need to talk about what civilization actually cost the people who invented it. Because the walls of Catalhoyuk tell 2 stories simultaneously. One is the story we have already been exploring, the story of ingenuity, of social invention, of people figuring out how to live together in numbers that should have been impossible, creating art and trade networks and burial practices and a way of life that persisted for 1,400 years. That story is extraordinary. It is genuinely inspiring. It represents one of the great achievements of the human species. But there is another story written in those same walls, and in the floors beneath them, and most powerfully in the bones of the people who lived and died there. And that story is darker. The bones do not lie. When physical anthropologists, the scientists who study ancient human remains, began systematically examining the skeletons recovered from beneath the floors of Catalhoyuk, they expected to find a population that was, by Neolithic standards, reasonably healthy. After all, these were people living in a large, apparently successful settlement. They had reliable food sources. They had shelter. They had the kind of social infrastructure that should, in theory, buffer individuals against the worst hardships of prehistoric life. What they found instead was a population under extraordinary stress. The bones told a story of chronic malnutrition, of infectious disease at rates far exceeding anything seen in contemporary hunter-gatherer populations, of repetitive strain injuries, the kind of damage that comes from performing the same physical motions day after day, year after year, grinding grain, carrying heavy loads, kneeling on hard floors for hours at a time, of dental pathology, cavities and abscesses and tooth loss, at rates that shocked the researchers who first documented them. Start with the teeth. Hunter-gatherers, both ancient and modern, tend to have surprisingly good teeth. Their diets are diverse: meat, fish, nuts, roots, fruits, leafy greens, and low in the refined starches that promote tooth decay. They use their teeth hard, certainly. There is often heavy wear from processing tough, fibrous foods. But cavities are relatively rare. The residents of Catalhoyuk had terrible teeth. Cavity rates among adults were dramatically higher than anything documented in pre-agricultural populations. The cause was obvious once you understood the diet. These people were eating enormous quantities of grain, wheat and barley ground into flour and baked into flatbreads that formed the caloric foundation of their diet. Grain is starchy. Starch breaks down into sugars in the mouth. Sugars feed the bacteria that cause tooth decay. The shift from a diverse hunter-gatherer diet to one dominated by a single starchy staple was, from a dental perspective, catastrophic. But the teeth were just the beginning. The long bones, femurs, tibiae, humeri, showed something equally troubling. Average stature had decreased. The people of Catalhoyuk were shorter than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Not dramatically shorter, not dwarfed, but measurably, consistently, statistically significantly shorter by 2 to 3 centimeters on average. This reduction in stature is a classic indicator of nutritional stress during childhood. When a growing child does not receive adequate nutrition, not enough calories, not enough protein, not enough of the micronutrients that support bone growth, the body compensates by growing less. The bones become shorter and sometimes less dense. The adult who results is smaller than they would have been with optimal nutrition. And the people of Catalhoyuk were not receiving optimal nutrition. Their diet was calorie-rich but nutritionally narrow. Grain provides energy. It provides carbohydrates in abundance. But it is relatively poor in several essential amino acids, in iron, in zinc, in certain vitamins that a diet based on wild game and diverse plant foods provides almost automatically. The switch to agriculture was, in nutritional terms, a significant step down from the dietary quality that mobile hunter-gatherers maintained through the sheer variety of their food sources. Then there was the evidence of anemia, a condition called cribra orbitalia. Tiny porous lesions on the roof of the eye socket appeared in a startlingly high percentage of Catalhoyuk skulls. This condition is caused by iron deficiency severe enough to force the body to expand bone marrow production in the skull, creating characteristic pitting in the thin bone above the eyes. Iron deficiency anemia. In a population that had access to domestic animals, to wild game, to the protein-rich resources of one of the most productive landscapes in the ancient world. How? The answer involves a combination of factors, each one a consequence of the sedentary, agricultural, densely packed lifestyle that Catalhoyuk represented. First, grain-based diets are naturally low in bioavailable iron. The iron in grain is bound up with phytates, chemical compounds that inhibit absorption in the human digestive system. You can eat enormous quantities of wheat and still not absorb enough iron to prevent anemia, especially if you are a woman of reproductive age losing iron through menstruation and pregnancy. Second, parasitic infection. When thousands of people live in close proximity without modern sanitation, intestinal parasites become endemic. Hookworm, roundworm, tapeworm, organisms that attach to the gut lining and feed on the host's blood and nutrients. These parasites drain iron from the body faster than a grain-based diet can replace it. The archaeological evidence for parasitism at Catalhoyuk is indirect but persuasive. The settlement's waste disposal practices, refuse thrown into the narrow spaces between buildings or accumulated in middens at the settlement's edge, would have created ideal breeding conditions for the parasites and their intermediate hosts. Flies, which breed in organic waste, are known vectors for several parasitic species. In a settlement where 10,000 people lived on 32 acres without running water or sewage systems, the fly population must have been extraordinary. Third, and perhaps most insidious, was the constant low-grade exposure to respiratory pathogens. The houses at Catalhoyuk were poorly ventilated. Remember, no windows, no doors at ground level, just that single roof hatch serving as the only opening. The hearth and oven produced smoke that had to rise through the same opening that served as the entrance. On cold nights, or during rain, that opening might be partially or fully covered. The interior of the house would fill with smoke. Modern studies of populations living in similar conditions, cooking over open fires in poorly ventilated structures, show dramatically elevated rates of respiratory disease. Chronic bronchitis, pneumonia, and lung damage from long-term smoke inhalation. The soot deposits found on the interior walls and ceilings of Catalhoyuk houses are thick. In some cases, multiple layers of soot separated by thin layers of replastering, showing that the residents periodically cleaned their walls but could never escape the fundamental ventilation problem. The lungs of Catalhoyuk's inhabitants, which, unlike bones, do not survive in the archaeological record, must have been severely compromised by decades of breathing smoke-filled air. And then there is the evidence that, more than anything else, tells the story of what dense urban living cost these first city dwellers. Infectious disease. When you concentrate thousands of people in a small area, you create the conditions for epidemic disease. Pathogens that would burn through a small, mobile band of 30 people and then die out for lack of new hosts can sustain themselves indefinitely in a population of 10,000. Diseases jump from domestic animals to humans, a process called zoonosis, and this risk increases dramatically when people live in close proximity to their livestock. The cattle pens at Catalhoyuk were right next to the living quarters. The sheep and goats were penned nearby. The flies that bred in animal dung moved freely between the animal areas and the human living spaces. We cannot identify specific diseases from bone evidence alone. Soft tissue infections leave no skeletal trace unless they become chronic enough to affect bone. But the indirect evidence is overwhelming. The high infant and child mortality rates at Catalhoyuk are consistent with epidemic infectious disease killing the most vulnerable members of the population. The evidence of chronic inflammation in many adult skeletons suggests bodies fighting infection constantly, immune systems under perpetual siege. The overall pattern of health at Catalhoyuk tells a story that would be repeated again and again throughout human history, every time a population urbanized. Moving into cities makes people sick. It degrades health across virtually every measurable dimension. And the people of Catalhoyuk were experiencing this for the very first time, with no understanding of what was causing it and no medical tradition to address it. They just knew that their children died at rates that would have horrified their hunter-gatherer ancestors. That coughs persisted through entire seasons. That wounds became infected and sometimes killed. That sometimes a sickness would move through the settlement like a slow wind, taking the old and the young and the already weakened, one after another, house after house, until it had burned through enough of the population to exhaust its fuel. And yet they stayed. This is the great paradox of Catalhoyuk, and indeed of all early cities. The evidence shows clearly that urban life was, in biological terms, significantly worse for human health than the mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyle it replaced. People were shorter, sicker, more malnourished, more parasitized, more prone to infectious disease, more likely to die young. By any purely biological measure, the invention of cities was a disaster. And yet people kept building them, kept living in them, kept expanding them. For 1,400 years at Catalhoyuk, for thousands of years more at sites across the Fertile Crescent and beyond. Why? This is not a trivial question. Natural selection, operating over the timescales involved, should have favored populations that avoided the health costs of urban living. Groups that maintained mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyles should have been healthier, more reproductively successful, and therefore more numerous over time. And indeed, for many centuries, mobile populations probably were healthier on an individual basis. But cities offered something that offset their biological costs, something that made the misery worthwhile. Several somethings, actually. First, sheer numbers. A settlement of 10,000 people, however sick and malnourished its individual members might be, represents an enormous concentration of human labor and human capability. It can mobilize collective projects, construction, defense, agricultural intensification, that no band of 50 hunter-gatherers could match. It can survive losses from disease, from famine, from conflict, that would destroy a small mobile group entirely. A band of 50 people that loses 10 members to an epidemic has lost 20% of its population and may not be viable. A city of 10,000 that loses 2,000 to the same epidemic still has 8,000 people and can recover within a generation. Redundancy. Resilience through numbers. The collective survives even when many individuals do not. Second, accumulated knowledge. In a small mobile band, specialized knowledge is fragile. If the one person who knows how to navigate by stars at night dies, that knowledge dies with them. But in a city of 10,000, knowledge becomes distributed and redundant. Multiple people know how to work obsidian. Multiple families understand grain cultivation. The collective knowledge base of the community is vastly larger and more resilient than anything a small group could maintain. Third, and perhaps most importantly, trade. Catalhoyuk's position as a center of obsidian tool production gave it economic relationships with communities across a vast geographic area. These relationships provided access to resources, foods, raw materials, genetic diversity through intermarriage that no isolated community could match. The obsidian trade was not a luxury. It was a lifeline, connecting the city to a network of exchange that buffered it against local resource failures and provided the economic surplus that allowed some of its residents to specialize in non-agricultural activities. So the calculus was grim but functional. Individual health suffered. Individual life expectancy declined. Individual quality of life, measured in purely physical terms, was worse than what mobile ancestors had experienced. But the community thrived. The population grew. The economic networks expanded. The cultural innovations, the art, the architecture, the ritual practices, the trade relationships, accumulated and compounded over generations. Civilization, it turns out, was built not on the health and happiness of individuals, but on the capacity of large groups to persist and innovate despite the suffering of their members. This is not a comfortable insight, but it is what the evidence shows. And then there is the violence. Because the people of Catalhoyuk were not living in some peaceful utopia. The egalitarian appearance of the settlement, the similar house sizes, the lack of obvious palaces or elite quarters, has sometimes been interpreted as evidence of a harmonious, conflict-free society. A kind of prehistoric commune where everyone cooperated willingly and disputes were resolved through calm consensus. The bones tell a different story. Among the adult skeletons excavated from beneath the floors of Catalhoyuk, a significant percentage show evidence of healed cranial fractures. Blows to the head. Not from accidents. The pattern of injury is distinctive. Accidents produce fractures that are typically located on the top or front of the skull, consistent with falling or striking overhead objects. The fractures at Catalhoyuk are concentrated on the back and sides of the skull. The back and sides. These are the locations where blows land when someone is struck by another person wielding a weapon or a heavy object. When you hit someone from behind. When you strike them from the side during a face-to-face confrontation. The most detailed analysis of these injuries found that a substantial proportion of adults, both male and female, showed evidence of at least one healed skull fracture consistent with interpersonal violence. The victims survived. The fractures healed. But the sheer frequency of these injuries suggests a community where physical violence was not rare. Not something that happened once a generation in an exceptional circumstance, but something that occurred with enough regularity to leave its mark on a significant portion of the population. Interestingly, the weapons most likely responsible for these injuries were the very clay balls that archaeologists found in large numbers throughout the settlement. Baked clay spheres, roughly the size of a tennis ball, that were apparently used as sling projectiles and cooking tools. Dual-purpose technology: heat your oven, crack someone's skull. The violence at Catalhoyuk appears to have been primarily internal. There is no evidence of fortification, no defensive walls, no moats or ditches or lookout towers. Unlike Jericho, which we will return to shortly, Catalhoyuk does not appear to have been built to defend against external enemies. The threats, it seems, came from within. And this makes a grim kind of sense. Put 10,000 people together in a space of 32 acres. Give them no formal legal system, no police force, no courts, no prisons. Give them no centralized authority capable of mediating disputes with the weight of legitimate force. Rely instead on social pressure, on kinship obligations, on the informal mechanisms of reputation and gossip and mutual surveillance that work beautifully in small communities where everyone knows everyone. And then watch what happens when those mechanisms are strained. When resources become scarce during a bad harvest year. When a trade relationship breaks down and one household loses its primary source of income. When personal grudges accumulate over years and decades in a community where you cannot simply move away from someone you hate, because the entire city is a continuous honeycomb of shared walls and you cannot avoid anyone. Violence, not organized warfare, not the institutional violence of states and armies that will come later, but the intimate, personal violence of people living too close together with too few mechanisms for resolving the conflicts that inevitably arise. The archaeological evidence suggests that the people of Catalhoyuk were aware of this problem, and some of the most distinctive features of the settlement may have been attempts to address it. That strange architecture, the roof entry houses, the shared walls, the complete absence of streets or ground-level public space, may have been, in part, a conflict management strategy. Think about it. If every house is entered from above, through a roof hatch, and the ladder can be pulled up behind you, then your house is effectively a fortress. No one can enter uninvited. No confrontation at the front door, because there is no front door. The architecture creates a physical boundary between households that is far more absolute than any wall shared with a neighboring room. You share walls, yes, but the only way into your space is through a hole in the ceiling that you control. The rooftop public space, meanwhile, is open and visible. Everyone can see everyone. Conflicts that might escalate in the privacy of enclosed spaces are exposed to public scrutiny on the rooftops, where the social pressure of thousands of watching eyes provides a powerful deterrent to violence. The design of Catalhoyuk may have been, in other words, an architectural solution to a social problem. How do you keep 10,000 people from killing each other when you have no police, no courts, and no king to impose order by force? You design the city so that private space is absolutely secure and public space is absolutely visible. You make it physically difficult to intrude on someone's domestic space, while making it socially impossible to misbehave in the shared areas where daily life is conducted. It was not a perfect solution. The skull fractures prove that. But it worked well enough, for long enough, to sustain the settlement for over a millennium. And the clay balls used as weapons may also have served a social function. Sling projectiles can be thrown from a distance. They allow conflict to occur without the physical proximity required for knife fighting or wrestling. They are painful, but usually not lethal. A clay ball to the back of the head will crack bone, but rarely kill, at least not immediately. This is a technology of intimidation and punishment rather than killing. A way to settle scores that usually doesn't end in death. Whether this was a deliberate social convention, an informal rule that disputes would be settled by sling rather than by blade, or simply a pattern that emerged from the practical availability of clay balls as improvised weapons, is impossible to know. But the effect is the same. A level of violence that was chronic but usually survivable. A city where conflict was constant but rarely catastrophic. A social experiment that persisted for 1,400 years not because it eliminated violence, but because it managed violence well enough to prevent the settlement from tearing itself apart. But nothing lasts forever. And Catalhoyuk did not last. Sometime around 5,700 BCE, after 1,400 years of continuous occupation, after dozens of generations had lived and died and been buried beneath those plaster floors, the people of Catalhoyuk left. Not suddenly, not in a single dramatic event. The archaeological evidence suggests a gradual decline, population thinning over perhaps a century or two, houses being abandoned and not rebuilt, fewer burials, less evidence of the obsidian trade that had sustained the settlement's economic life, and then, eventually, emptiness. The last families climbing their ladders for the final time, crossing the rooftops one last time, descending the outer edge of the mound, and walking away from the city their ancestors had built 900 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza, 1,500 years before Stonehenge, 3,000 years before the first writing appeared in Mesopotamia. Why? Why did they leave? This is one of the great unsolved puzzles of Neolithic archaeology, and the truth is that we do not have a definitive answer. But we have evidence. And the evidence points to several factors converging to make the Catalhoyuk experiment unsustainable. First, environmental degradation. 1,400 years of continuous occupation by thousands of people had taken a toll on the landscape surrounding the settlement. The forests that once provided timber for construction and fuel for cooking and heating had been cut back for miles in every direction. As forests retreated, the wood had to be brought from farther and farther away, increasing the labor cost of one of the settlement's most basic necessities. The soils immediately around the settlement, farmed continuously for over a millennium, were likely depleted despite whatever fallow and rotation practices the farmers employed. Agricultural productivity was declining, or at least not keeping pace with the demands of the population. The alluvial plain on which Catalhoyuk sat was prone to seasonal flooding, and there is evidence that the hydrological patterns of the area were shifting during the later phases of occupation, possibly as a result of upstream deforestation and landscape modification by human activity, possibly due to broader climatic fluctuations. The environmental foundation on which the city was built was, in other words, being undermined by the city's own existence. Second, social strain. There are hints in the archaeological record that the egalitarian social structures of Catalhoyuk's early phases were beginning to fray in the later periods. Later building levels show more variation in house size and elaboration. Some households appear to have been accumulating more wealth, more stored goods, more elaborate burials, more decorative objects than others. The subtle social differentiation that had always existed was becoming less subtle. If social cohesion at Catalhoyuk depended on the perception of rough equality, on the shared understanding that no household was dramatically better off than any other, then increasing visible inequality would have been corrosive. It would have undermined the implicit social contract that kept 10,000 people cooperating without centralized authority. Third, and perhaps most interestingly, there is evidence that the very model of Catalhoyuk, the rooftop city, the shared wall architecture, the ancestor burial domestic religion, was spreading. Smaller satellite settlements appearing in the surrounding region during the later phases of Catalhoyuk's occupation suggest that some portion of the population was splitting off, establishing new communities that replicated elements of the original settlement's design, but on a smaller, more manageable scale. Catalhoyuk may not have died. It may have reproduced, spawning daughter settlements that drew population away from the increasingly stressed original site, diffusing the urban experiment across a wider landscape rather than concentrating it in a single location. This is a pattern that will repeat throughout history. Cities grow until they reach the limits of their environmental and social sustainability. Then they fragment, sending populations outward to establish new centers that carry the cultural DNA of the original settlement into new territories. The end of Catalhoyuk was not the end of the ideas that Catalhoyuk represented. It was their dispersal. The urban impulse, the drive to live in permanent, dense, socially complex communities, did not die with the last family to leave that mound in the Kanya Plain. It migrated. It evolved. It found new forms and new expressions in dozens of new locations across the Fertile Crescent and beyond. And in some of those locations, it produced results that were, if anything, even more extraordinary than Catalhoyuk itself. But before we follow the urban idea outward from Catalhoyuk, we need to go back in time. Because Catalhoyuk was not humanity's only experiment in early urban living. It was not even the first. And some of the experiments that preceded it, or ran parallel to it, are even more mysterious. even more challenging to our assumptions about what early human societies were capable of. Let us talk about Jericho. When archaeologists first investigated the ancient tell of Jericho, that artificial mound of accumulated human occupation in the Jordan Valley, near the northern shore of the Dead Sea, they expected to find a modest prehistoric settlement. What they found instead was a fortification. Walls. Massive stone walls, constructed from undressed boulders, rising to a height of nearly 4 meters, 13 feet, and surrounding an area of roughly 10 acres. Behind the walls, a stone tower. Not a watchtower in the modern military sense. Something different. A massive circular structure, roughly 9 meters in diameter at the base and rising to a height of over 8 meters, nearly 28 feet. Solid stone construction. An internal staircase of 22 steps leading from bottom to top. The oldest known stone staircase in the world. Built sometime around 8000 BCE. 11,000 years ago. Before pottery. Before metal. Before writing. Before any of the technologies we associate with monumental construction. People who had been farming for perhaps only a few generations. People whose grandparents or great-grandparents had been mobile hunter-gatherers, built a stone tower 28 feet tall with an internal staircase, and surrounded their settlement with defensive walls. The question that immediately arises is, why? What were they defending against? Who were they defending against? For decades, the standard interpretation was straightforward. Jericho was a fortified settlement. The walls were military defensive works. The tower was a watchtower, providing advance warning of approaching enemies. The whole complex was evidence that warfare, organized, large-scale military conflict, was already a feature of human life by 800 BCE, requiring communities to invest enormous collective labor in defensive architecture. This interpretation made intuitive sense. Humans are violent. Resources are worth fighting over. Of course, the first permanent settlements would have needed walls to keep enemies out. But then archaeologists looked more carefully, and the military interpretation started falling apart. The walls of Jericho are not built like military fortifications. They are not thick enough to resist sustained assault. They have no bastions, no towers at regular intervals along their length, no fighting platforms at the top from which defenders could repel attackers. The single tower is not positioned for optimal defensive advantage. It is inside the walls, not at a vulnerable point along the perimeter, and its placement seems designed for visibility of the surrounding landscape rather than for military command of the approach routes. Moreover, there is no evidence of warfare at Jericho during the period when the walls and tower were built. No arrowheads embedded in walls. No evidence of fire damage consistent with assault. No mass graves of battle casualties. Nothing in the skeletal record to suggest the population was experiencing the kind of violent conflict that would justify the massive labor investment of building fortifications. So if the walls weren't primarily military, what were they? Several alternative hypotheses have been proposed, and each one tells us something interesting about what the first permanent settlements were actually for. One possibility is flood control. Jericho sits at the base of the Judean hills, where seasonal water flows could produce flash floods capable of damaging or destroying a low-lying settlement. The walls and tower may have been engineered responses to a hydrological problem rather than a military threat. Another possibility is symbolic. The walls define the boundary of the community. They mark the line between inside and outside, between the domesticated world of the settlement and the wild world beyond. In a society where the distinction between human-controlled space and natural space was being drawn for the very first time, the physical marking of that boundary with massive stone construction would have carried enormous psychological and spiritual weight. The wall says, here is where we are. Here is what belongs to us. Here is the line between the world we have made and the world that made us. The tower, in this interpretation, becomes not a watchtower but a monument. A statement of collective identity and collective capability. We can build this. We can organize the labor of hundreds of people over months or years to create a structure that serves no immediate practical purpose but demonstrates, to ourselves and to anyone who sees it, what we are capable of when we work together. A third possibility, proposed more recently, combines elements of both. The tower at Jericho appears to be aligned with the summer solstice sunset. On the longest day of the year, The shadow of the nearby hills falls precisely across the tower at sunset, creating a visual effect that would have been dramatically visible to anyone standing on or near the structure. If this alignment is intentional, and the precision of it makes coincidence unlikely, then the tower was, at least in part, an astronomical instrument. A calendar marker. A device for tracking the movement of the sun across the sky, information that would have been critically important for an agricultural community dependent on knowing when to plant and when to harvest. The Tower of Jericho may have been all three things simultaneously: flood defense, identity monument, and astronomical observatory. That is what makes early human settlements so fascinating and so difficult to interpret through modern categories. We want to assign single purposes to structures. This is a house. This is a temple. This is a fort. But the people who built these things did not think in those categories. Their buildings were multifunctional in ways that reflect a worldview where practical, social, and spiritual concerns were not separated into distinct domains, but woven together into a single, integrated understanding of what it meant to be human in a built environment. Jericho was not Catalhoyuk. It was smaller, perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 people at its peak. It was organized differently, with walls and a tower rather than the rooftop honeycomb of the Turkish site. Its social structure may have been different, though the evidence is too fragmentary to draw firm conclusions. But it was engaged in the same fundamental experiment. How do humans live together in permanent settlements? What structures, physical, social, spiritual, do they need to build to make that experiment work? And it was conducting that experiment at roughly the same time, in roughly the same part of the world, apparently independently. The urban impulse was not a single invention that spread from one source. It was a convergent innovation, emerging in multiple locations simultaneously as different populations responded to similar environmental and social pressures. People were figuring out how to build settlements in the Jordan Valley. People were figuring out how to build settlements in the Konya Plain of Turkey. People were figuring it out in the Zagros Mountains of what is now Iran and Iraq. People were figuring it out along the upper reaches of the Euphrates in what is now Syria. Different solutions, different architectures, different social arrangements. But the same fundamental question being asked and answered over and over across thousands of miles and thousands of years. How do we live together? And then there is the site that changed everything. The site that, when it was fully excavated and understood, forced archaeologists to rewrite the entire story of human civilization from the beginning. Göbekli Tepe. High on a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, about 15 kilometers northeast of the modern city of Şanlıurfa, there is a hill. Not a natural hill. An artificial one, roughly 50 feet high and 1,000 feet across, created by the deliberate burial and covering of a monumental stone complex that was built, used, and then intentionally filled in and abandoned over a period of approximately 2,000 years. From roughly 9,500 BCE to roughly 7,500 BCE, before Catalhoyuk, before Jericho's walls, before agriculture was fully established anywhere on Earth, before pottery, before domestic animals, before any of the material preconditions that archaeologists had always insisted were necessary for monumental construction. When German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt first began serious excavation at Göbekli Tepe in 1994, he knew from surface surveys that there was worked stone on the hilltop. Carved blocks. Fragments of what appeared to be pillars. He expected a modest Neolithic sanctuary, perhaps built by an early farming community. What he found beneath the surface of that hill left him stunned. And it has left the archaeological world struggling to adjust its fundamental assumptions ever since. Göbekli Tepe is a complex of massive stone enclosures, at least 20 of them, of which only a handful have been fully excavated, each containing enormous T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in circles. The pillars are not rough-hewn blocks. They are carefully shaped, precisely carved. Some stand nearly 20 feet tall and weigh between 10 and 20 tons. They were quarried from limestone bedrock hundreds of meters from the construction site, somehow transported uphill, erected vertically in precisely dug foundation sockets, and then carved with elaborate relief sculptures. Animals, not domestic animals, not the cattle and sheep and goats of the agricultural world. Wild animals, foxes, boars, snakes, scorpions, lions, vultures, aurochs, gazelles, cranes, spiders, and more. A menagerie of wild fauna rendered with varying degrees of realism and stylization, covering the flat surfaces of these massive pillars. Some of the animals are depicted with aggressive postures, bared teeth, erect tails, threatening stances. Others appear more neutral, simply present, part of the landscape of the wild world. And the pillars themselves, the T-shaped forms that serve as the canvas for this carved bestiary, appear to be representations of human beings. Stylized, abstract, but recognizably anthropomorphic. Some have arms carved in low relief along their sides, hands meeting at the front, fingers extending toward what would be the belt area of a standing figure. Some have what appear to be garments or belts suggested in the stone. Some have foxes or other animals carved at their base, as if sitting at their feet. The T-shape is a body. The crossbar of the T is a head, featureless, blank, but unmistakably the top of a humanoid form. These are stone people. 20-foot-tall stone people standing in circles, their surfaces crawling with images of wild animals, gazing inward at each other across circular enclosures that could hold hundreds of real people. And the people who built them were not farmers. The extensive analysis of plant and animal remains from Göbekli Tepe confirms what the dating suggests. This site was constructed by hunter-gatherers, people who had not yet domesticated any plants or animals, people who were still living primarily on wild game and wild grain, people who, according to everything archaeologists had believed until Göbekli Tepe was excavated, should not have been capable of this. Because monumental architecture requires organized labor. It requires the ability to feed and coordinate hundreds of workers over extended periods. It requires planning, engineering knowledge, logistical capability, all of which, according to the standard model of human social development, come after agriculture. After surplus food production allows people to support non-farming specialists. After hierarchical social structures develop to organize and direct collective labor. Göbekli Tepe was built before any of that. It was built by people who were, technically, still living in the Stone Age in the most literal sense. No metal tools, no pottery, no domestic animals to haul stone, no wheeled vehicles, no pulleys or cranes, just human muscle, stone tools, and an organizational capability that nobody thought hunter-gatherers possessed. The implications were staggering, and they became even more staggering as the excavation progressed and the full extent of the site became clear. Göbekli Tepe was not a settlement. There are no houses, no hearths for cooking, no storage facilities, no evidence that anyone lived there permanently. It was, as far as the evidence shows, a purely ritual site. A place built for the specific purpose of gathering, of ceremony, of whatever spiritual or social activities these enormous stone enclosures were designed to facilitate. People came to Göbekli Tepe from surrounding areas, perhaps from considerable distances, to participate in whatever happened there, and then they left. They came, they gathered, they feasted. The enormous quantities of animal bones found at the site, primarily from wild game, suggest large-scale communal meals, and then they returned to wherever they had come from. This upended the standard model completely. The standard model said, first agriculture, then surplus, then specialization, then religion, then monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe said, first religion, then monumental architecture, then maybe, possibly as a consequence rather than a cause, agriculture. Because here is the remarkable thing. The area around Göbekli Tepe is one of the places where genetic analysis has identified the earliest domestication of einkorn wheat. The wild ancestor of one of humanity's founding crops grows naturally on the hills near this site. And the earliest cultivated forms of this wheat appear in the archaeological record at roughly the same time as the construction of Göbekli Tepe or shortly after. It is possible. Schmidt himself suggested this before his death in 2014, and subsequent researchers have developed the idea further that the construction of Göbekli Tepe was itself a driver of agricultural development. Think about the logistics. You need to bring hundreds of people together to quarry, transport, and erect 20-ton stone pillars. Those people need to eat. They need to eat a lot. Stone quarrying and hauling is brutally hard physical labor. Feeding hundreds of workers on wild game and gathered grain is possible for short periods. But the scale and duration of the Göbekli Tepe project would have strained the carrying capacity of wild food resources in the area. What if the need to feed the builders drove the first experiments in cultivation? What if people started deliberately planting grain near the construction site to ensure reliable food supplies for the workforce? What if agriculture was invented not to feed families and villages, but to feed work crews building monuments to the gods, or to whatever spiritual forces these stone enclosures were meant to engage? Religion before agriculture, temples before houses, the sacred before the practical. This is the inversion of everything the 20th century believed about the origins of civilization. And Göbekli Tepe makes a powerful, though not yet conclusive, case for it. The site also tells us something else, something about the nature of early human social organization that connects directly to the story of Çatalhöyük and Jericho and every other early settlement we have discussed. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried, not destroyed, not abandoned and left to crumble. Deliberately, carefully, intentionally filled in with earth and rubble, covering the stone enclosures completely and creating the artificial hill that preserved them for 11,000 years. This burial appears to have happened in stages, with older enclosures being filled in and newer, somewhat smaller ones being built on top or adjacent, until eventually the entire complex was covered over and abandoned. Why would you bury a monument that required thousands of hours of labor to build? Why would you destroy, or at least hide, something that clearly held enormous significance for the community that created it? One possibility is that the enclosures had specific ritual lifespans. They were built for a particular purpose, served that purpose for a generation or two, and then were ritually decommissioned by burial. The act of burying them was itself a ritual, a way of closing a chapter, of sending the power contained in those stone circles back into the earth. Another possibility is that the burial was connected to broader social changes. As agriculture developed, as populations settled, as the social structures that had organized the construction of Göbekli Tepe evolved into something different, the old ritual center lost its function. The gatherings of mobile hunter-gatherer bands that had built and used these enclosures were no longer happening because those bands were no longer mobile. They were settling down, building villages, developing new forms of social and spiritual organization that made the old gathering site obsolete. The burial of Göbekli Tepe may mark the transition from one kind of society to another, from the mobile, dispersed, seasonally gathering world of the late hunter-gatherers to the settled, permanent, agriculturally based world of the early Neolithic. The old world buried its monuments as it gave way to the new, and the new world built Çatalhöyük. The connection is not direct. Göbekli Tepe and Çatalhöyük are separated by several hundred miles and several hundred years. They were built by different populations with different cultures, but they are part of the same vast, slow, transformative process. The process by which scattered bands of mobile humans became settled communities, by which communities became towns, by which towns became cities, by which the human experiment in collective living began to produce the complexity, social, economic, spiritual, technological, that we call civilization. Let us return now to the question of why Çatalhöyük was abandoned and what happened after. Because the end of Çatalhöyük was not the end of the story. It was barely the beginning. When the population of Çatalhöyük dispersed around 5,700 BCE, the urban idea did not die with the settlement. It scattered. Smaller sites in the region show the influence of Çatalhöyük's architectural and cultural traditions. House designs reminiscent of the rooftop city appear in settlements across central Anatolia. Burial practices involving subfloor interment persist in the region for centuries after Çatalhöyük's abandonment. The obsidian trade networks that had sustained the city's economy continued to operate, redirecting their output to the new, smaller settlements that replaced it. But the urban model itself was evolving. The specific features that defined Çatalhöyük, the shared wall honeycomb, the rooftop pathways, the doorless, windowless, ladder-accessed houses, did not replicate exactly in most of the successor settlements. Instead, something different emerged. Streets appeared, not immediately, not everywhere at once, but gradually, across the 6th and 5th millennia BCE, settlements in the Fertile Crescent and beyond began incorporating public pathways between buildings. Spaces that belonged to no one and everyone. channels of movement and social interaction that were distinct from the domestic interior. This seems like a small thing. A street is such a basic feature of urban design that we take it for granted. But remember, Catalhoyuk had existed for 1400 years without them. The invention of the street was an innovation as significant, in its way, as the invention of the city itself. Because streets change everything about how a city functions socially. They create public space that is neither domestic nor wild. A new kind of space, a social space, where strangers encounter each other, where commerce can occur, where collective life is conducted. Streets allow movement without requiring passage through or over someone else's private space. They permit the development of specialized commercial and public buildings, markets, workshops, meeting halls, eventually temples, that can front onto shared thoroughfares and be accessed by anyone. They also, critically, allow privacy. In Catalhoyuk, where public life happened on everyone's roof, privacy was limited to what occurred below the roofline. Once streets exist, houses can have solid, unbroken roof surfaces. They can have doors that open onto public pathways, but close to seal the domestic interior from view. The boundary between public and private becomes negotiable, adjustable, under the control of the household rather than determined by the necessities of rooftop transit. Streets also allow segregation. Once public space exists between buildings, it becomes possible for different types of buildings to cluster in different areas. Workshops in one quarter, residences in another, religious structures in a third. Elite housing distinguished from common housing not just by internal elaboration, but by location, proximity to the central temple, to the market, to the water supply. The emergence of streets, in other words, enabled the development of the hierarchical, stratified urban forms that would characterize every subsequent city in human history. The egalitarian honeycomb of Catalhoyuk, where everyone lived in essentially the same kind of house accessed in essentially the same way, was a product of its unique architecture. Once that architecture gave way to the street-based city, equality of access and equality of living conditions became much harder to maintain. And they were not maintained. The settlements that followed Catalhoyuk, in Mesopotamia, in the Levant, in Egypt, eventually across the entire ancient world, show increasing social stratification over time. Bigger houses for some, smaller houses for others, central locations for the powerful, peripheral locations for the poor, temples growing larger and more elaborate while ordinary dwellings remained simple, palaces appearing for the first time, structures that were explicitly, architecturally, unmistakably the residences of rulers rather than ordinary community members. The urban experiment was continuing, but it was changing its character. The roughly egalitarian, collectively organized, apparently leaderless model of Catalhoyuk was giving way to something that would have been unrecognizable to its founders. Hierarchy, centralized authority, institutional religion with professional priesthoods, taxation, conscript labor. Eventually, writing, invented not to record poetry or philosophy, but to keep track of grain stores and labor obligations and debts. The urban idea was becoming civilization as we traditionally understand it, with all its achievements and all its costs. And those costs were mounting, because every advance in social complexity brought new problems. Every increase in population density intensified the health burdens that the people of Catalhoyuk had already experienced. Every increase in hierarchy and inequality created new sources of social tension and conflict. Every increase in agricultural dependence deepened the vulnerability of settled populations to crop failure, drought, and environmental degradation. The pattern established at Catalhoyuk, cities that are simultaneously brilliant and destructive, that represent humanity's highest collective achievements and impose terrible costs on the individuals who inhabit them, repeated itself across the ancient world with relentless consistency. In Mesopotamia, where the world's first true states emerged in the 4th millennium BCE, the Sumerian city-states achieved extraordinary levels of cultural and technological sophistication. They invented writing. They developed mathematics. They built monumental architecture that still astonishes. They created legal codes, literary traditions, astronomical knowledge, engineering capabilities that would not be matched in many parts of the world for thousands of years. And the skeletal remains of their ordinary citizens show the same patterns documented at Catalhoyuk 4,000 years earlier. Malnutrition, anemia, dental disease, shortened stature, evidence of repetitive labor injuries, evidence of endemic parasitic and infectious disease, high infant and child mortality, short adult life expectancy. The surplus produced by Mesopotamian agriculture was real, but it was captured primarily by elites, by the temples and palaces and their associated bureaucracies, while the farming population that produced it lived in conditions that were, in many measurable respects, worse than what their hunter-gatherer ancestors had experienced 5,000 years before. This is not a romantic idealization of pre-agricultural life. Hunter-gatherer existence was not paradise. It had its own hardships, its own dangers, its own forms of suffering. But the consistent, cross-cultural, repeatedly documented finding that early agricultural and urban populations were less healthy than the hunter-gatherer populations they replaced is one of the most robust results in physical anthropology. The invention of cities was, from the perspective of individual human health and well-being, a mistake. A productive mistake. A creative mistake. A mistake that generated art and science and literature and philosophy and every cultural achievement we value. But a mistake nonetheless, at least in the narrow biological sense. And the people living in those early cities knew it. They may not have understood the mechanisms. They didn't know about bacteria or parasites or nutritional deficiency. But they could see the results. Their children died. Their teeth rotted. Their backs ached from years of labor. They got sick more often and took longer to recover. They could look at the mobile peoples who still lived beyond the city walls. And there were such peoples, in every era, populations that maintained hunting and gathering or pastoral nomadic lifestyles alongside the settled agricultural societies, and see that those people were, in many visible respects, healthier and more robust. And yet they stayed, generation after generation, century after century, millennium after millennium. They stayed in their cities, endured the diseases and the labor and the inequality and the violence, and they kept building. They stayed because, despite everything, cities offered something that nothing else could provide: connection, scale, complexity, the accumulated knowledge and creativity and cultural richness that only emerges when thousands of minds interact in close proximity over long periods of time. They stayed because cities, for all their biological costs, were the engines of everything that made human life meaningful beyond mere survival. Art comes from cities. Music comes from cities. Philosophy comes from cities. Science comes from cities. The entire accumulated cultural heritage of the human species, every idea, every invention, every creative work that has shaped our understanding of ourselves and our world, is a product of urban life. Of people living together in the dense, difficult, disease-ridden, violent, brilliant, astonishing, terrible, miraculous places we call cities. It started at Catalhoyuk, and at Jericho, and at Göbekli Tepe, and at 100 other sites across the ancient world where people decided, for reasons that were sometimes desperate and sometimes visionary and sometimes both at once, to stop wandering and start building. They could not have known what they were starting. They could not have predicted that their small, smoky, crowded, skull-decorated rooms would lead, over 9,000 years, to Tokyo and New York and Lagos and Sao Paulo. They could not have imagined that the choices they made, to plant grain, to pen animals, to build walls, to bury their dead beneath their floors, to live together in numbers that strained every aspect of human biology and psychology, would echo through every subsequent generation of human existence. But they did it. They made those choices, and we are still living inside the consequences. Every city on Earth today is a descendant of those first experiments. Every urban problem, sanitation, disease, inequality, violence, environmental degradation, was first encountered by the people who walked across the rooftops of Catalhoyuk 9,000 years ago. Every urban achievement, the accumulation of knowledge, the flowering of creativity, the emergence of complex social institutions capable of coordinating human activity at scale, traces its ancestry to those same rooftops. The story of the first cities is not just ancient history. It is the origin story of the world we live in now, and it is still being written. But we are not done with the ancient world yet. Because the experiments that began at Catalhoyuk and Jericho and Göbekli produced, over the following millennia, a series of urban civilizations that tested the limits of what human societies could achieve, and revealed, with sometimes devastating clarity, the limits of what human societies could sustain. The trail leads from Anatolia and the Levant southward and eastward, into the river valleys of Mesopotamia, where the urban idea would reach its next great transformation, where the city would become the state, where the experiment would scale up from thousands to tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, where writing and law and bureaucracy and empire would emerge, not from the dreams of visionary leaders, but from the practical necessities of managing human complexity at a scale that the founders of Catalhoyuk could never have imagined, and where the costs, the human costs, the environmental costs, the social costs, would scale up as well. The cities of Mesopotamia were the children of Catalhoyuk. They inherited its problems, and they created new ones of their own. The next chapter of the story takes us to the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates, to Uruk, the first city that was indisputably, unmistakably, undeniably a city. The city that gave its name to Iraq. The city where writing was invented. The city where kingship first appeared. The city where the full, complex, glorious, terrible apparatus of what we call civilization finally crystallized into its recognizable form. But that is for the next part. For now, sit with this, with the knowledge that 10,000 years ago, people who were no different from you, no less intelligent, no less creative, no less capable of love and fear and ambition and wonder, faced the same fundamental question that every generation since has had to answer. How do we live together? They answered it with walls and rooftops and painted plaster and the bones of their ancestors beneath their feet. They answered it imperfectly, at great cost, with violence and disease and inequality creeping in despite their best efforts to hold those forces at bay. They answered it beautifully, too, with art that still moves us across 9 millennia of distance, with social innovations that still echo in the structure of every community on Earth. And they kept answering it, for 1,400 years, before the weight of their own success finally forced them to find new answers, in new places, for new generations. The experiment continues. It has never stopped. Every city you have ever walked through is a continuation of the experiment that began at Catalhoyuk. Every street you have ever crossed is an innovation that postdates the rooftop pathways of the world's first urban center. Every wall you have ever touched connects you, through an unbroken chain of human construction and human ambition and human stubbornness, to those first walls. The oldest walls, the walls that changed everything.